All right, let's get started with our Chapter 15, Theory of Evolution notes. Now remember that evolution is a change in a population over time, not an individual, but a population. So populations evolve, not individuals, and that's important for you to know and understand, not only for this, but for the test. This picture here shows the changes of the horses, just like we had done in that activity and in that video that we watched. See how the early Hydrocotheriums look very different to our equus that we have nowadays. And there's reasons for that because of their changes in their environment, just like that activity we did. In 1931, Charles Darwin took a job as a naturalist on board the HMS Beagle. He sailed around the world on a 5-year scientific journey and collected fossils and biological specimens. He kept detailed notes, brought back specimens with him, and then he spent the next 20 years refining his explanation. Why did he notice these changes of these fossils and these organisms over time? And we call that natural selection. Now, and remember, natural selection is how organisms change in populations. And again, don't forget the story of our peppered moths. We have our white ones here and our black ones here, and how that gene frequency changed. We had both types of moths present within that gene pool, but then they changed because of the environmental changes that took place. There are 4 major components of Darwin's theory of natural selection. Number 1, organisms produce more offspring than can possibly survive. And they do that so that some will survive. In every population, there is a variation among individuals. They are not all the same. Just like our little brown beetles here, they're not all the same. We have some little green ones. The green ones in this environment, get picked off quicker because they're seen quicker. But if the environment would change where the green would mingle in better with the environment than the brown, then the brown would get picked off. And then that gene frequency would change because of that. Number 3 is individuals with variations that help them survive or reproduce more successfully are going to be the ones that are going to be passed down than those without those useful variations. So individuals that have those variations that are going to allow them to reproduce and to live long enough in that environment to reproduce are the ones that are going to survive. Those variations are the ones that are going to become prevalent. Over time, organisms with these useful variations make up most of the population, and they look entirely different. Remember when we talked about the fish here and how it developed bones in the upper fin, and so it was able to walk funny and get back into the water. Just like in our video that we watched about the precursors to the whales, they walked on land first, and they had different characteristics or variations that allowed them to survive when that environment changed. Now, Alfred Wallace was the guy who kind of pushed Darwin into publishing his work because he was doing some of the same work and he was going to publish his work, and Darwin knew that if he published it first, he would get credit for it. So Darwin did publish his work. In 1859, Darwin's work was published. It was called On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection by Charles Darwin. What are some evidence for evolution? There's a variety of types of evidence that support the evolutionary theory. So we're going to talk about the individual ones. Number 1, adaptations. That's any variation that aids an organism's chance of survival. It could be structural, such as mimicry, camouflage, hair, etc. The bean activity we did was a great example of adaptation. And that would be a structural adaptation because that was camouflage. Physiological adaptation, a good example of that is the bacteria that becomes resistant to the antibiotics that we have today. They physiologically change so that they are able to survive even though we're trying to kill them off. Structural adaptations develop over millions of years, but physiological adaptations can develop quite rapidly. So keep that in mind for your test, that, physical structural adaptations develop over millions of years. Think about the organism that became the whale. It took 50 million years to have those structural adaptations develop so that that organism could be best adapted to that environment. Fossils provide a great evidence of change in populations over time. The fossil record, however, is incomplete, and that can make it have gaps that we then have to kind of look at and figure out, where things had come and that type of thing. Anatomy. You need to know what a homologous structure is, and these have common evolutionary origins. They're inherited from a common ancestor. A great example of this is the vertebrate's forearms. You look at the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat, and you can really tell that at some point in time they were very similar. That's very different than analogous structures. And a good example of this are those insect wings and bird wings. And what happens is these are structures that have evolved in an environment with similar environmental pressures. So these organisms, they did not themselves have a common ancestry, but their environmental pressures were similar. Vestigial structures or body structures in organisms that live today no longer serve an original purpose. You need to know this for the test. You need to know some examples of this. Appendix is one in humans, eyes in blind mole rats, wings in ostriches, pelvises in whales. So this suggests that at one point your whale had a pelvis, just like that organism that we saw in that video that was 50 million years ago. Embryology, you need to know that that is the earliest stage of growth and development in organisms. If you have shared embryology, it suggests that you have a common ancestry. Again, a distant common ancestry. Another piece of evidence, type of evidence, is biochemistry. We talked about this before in our other chapters. We talked about how they all have common nucleotides, the same 4 nitrogenous bases that come together to make up the genetic information. It's the sequences of those that make them different in different species. So let's talk about the mechanisms of evolution. Populations evolve, not individuals. You really need to keep that in mind. So in other words, an individual's genotype, it's what causes a certain physical characteristic. Since that individual cannot change its genotype, it cannot change its phenotype. So it's not the individual that's going to change that. The population is going to change. So when we looked at those camouflages, it was not the individual beads that turned color. Your pinks didn't turn to purple that lasted. The population changed to be the more purple. So how do populations evolve? How does this happen? First of all, we have what's a gene pool. That is the alleles. And we talked about, when we did our bean activity, the brown bean and the white bean. Those are alleles. You get one allele from each parent that gives you a trait. Well, a gene pool is all of the alleles in a population that make up that group. An allelic frequency is the percentage of any specific allele in the gene pool. We calculated that when we did that bean activity. The allelic frequency, we calculated the percent of brown and the percent of white. We calculated those percentages, and that's what an allelic frequency is. Now, a genetic equilibrium, now we know that equilibrium is when things are equal. It's when the gene frequency remains the same over generations. So that would be as if those frequencies stayed at 50-50 for generation after generation after generation after generation. That's genetic equilibrium. That means that population is not evolving. So you need to know that. Genetic equilibrium means that population is not evolving. So what happens when we have changes in genetic equilibrium? Well, first of all, any factor that affects the genes can change the frequency. This results in evolution or change in population over time. So any factor that's going to affect that gene within that gene pool can change the frequency that we talked about. So that can affect the genetic equilibrium. It can make it not be equal anymore. So what are some mechanisms to change genes' frequency? Number one, mutations can do that. If it results in a gene that produces a useful variation, and we talked about that, a useful variation, then the new gene allows the organism to be able to be successful to live long enough to reproduce. Eventually, that useful variation will become more prevalent in the population. So mutations is one way to change the gene frequency. A second way to change the gene frequency is genetic drift. And these are things that change the allelic frequency by chance events. The founder effect is a few individuals, they find a new population. If those individuals have a high frequency of a certain gene, that gene pool of their descendants will have a high frequency of that gene. So if you look down here, and we have 20 pink and 10 pink, and then in our new one, we have 1 pink and 3 red, you have a higher frequency of red in this new found population versus the initial one where pink was the dominant gene frequency. So we had a few individuals find a new population, so that small group breaks off from that population, and what happens is you no longer have the pink that's more dominant, has a higher frequency. It has become the red. An example of this is the Amish population. The Amish population obviously are Homo sapiens, just like all of us, but they are a population that breaks off to be on their own. So they are going to have different genes that are going to be more popular, that are going to be more frequent in their gene pool than in the large gene pool. Cheetahs, same type of effect, where they have been a population that has been broke off, and then it can make that population look very, very different genetically. Not necessarily phenotypically, but they can have different diseases and challenges, etc., based on that. Third thing that can affect it is the gene flow. And this is, when organisms move in and out of a community or in and out of a population, then they take their genes with them. So, for example, if all of the white beans or the white rabbits moved out of that population, then it's going to affect that gene pool of that other population. So whatever moves in and out is going to affect that. So that's called gene flow, right? Now, so we've got, which is different than genetic drift. Genetic drift is when we have a few organisms that drift off onto their own. And genetic flow is when is exactly that. We have individuals flowing in and out of a population. So we're not changing the makeup as drastically as you would with, say, a genetic drift. All right? So mutation, genetic drift, and gene pool affect a small population very significantly. But the larger population does not, you don't get a noticeable change in the larger population. That means, and this is really important, and this is a crux of a lot of the questions on the test, that natural selection causes the most significant changes in an established gene pool. Natural selection causes the most significant changes in an established gene pool. And those are changes that come about as a result of changes in that environment. So let's talk about the evolutions of a species, an individual species, not a whole population, but of a species, which is a group of organisms. It is a population, but what does it mean when we talk about human Homo sapiens and their evolution? It's a group of organisms. They look alike, they act alike, they can interbreed, which means they can mate, but they need to produce fertile offspring to be able to be a species, considered a species, and that is on the test. Speciation is when within that species we get an evolution of a new species, and that's when members of similar populations, they no longer interbreed to produce offspring. So speciation is the evolution of a new species. It's when the members of a similar population can no longer interbreed to produce offspring. What separates these populations so they cannot interbreed? Well, it could be a geographical isolation. It could be a river that separates the two of them, that one half of the population from another half of the population, thus changing the genetic, the frequency, the allele frequency. So it could be some physical barrier. And then what happens is you get that physical barrier, then after many generations, the genetic differences, they look very, very different. The populations look very, very different. And after the river dries up, and these genetic differences prevent interbreeding. They're so different now because of that isolation that they can't breed together. We call that speciation. Another thing that can cause it, geographic isolation, is reproductive isolation. When a organism that used to be able to mate can no longer mate and produce fertile offspring, for whatever reason that might be, then it can then change those organisms and the things that they actually feed on, or how they adapt to their environment. Third thing is genetic isolation. That's when the genetic material is so different that they can no longer reproduce. And that can be a result of reproductive isolation and geographic isolation. Or they could just be genetically to the point where they cannot mate and produce fertile offspring. Another type is behavioral isolation. This is difference in mating behaviors or rituals, and this prevents organisms from coming in contact with each other or recognizing each other. So what happens is it could be how they go about attracting their mate or where they need to mate that may cause that to narrow down what other organism they can mate with. So it's behavioral isolation. So let's talk about this. How fast does all of this happen? First of all, there's two ideas out there. Number one is gradualism. That's the idea that these species originate through gradual change and adaptations over millions of years. So keep that in mind. Gradualism means that you have your organism and over time they are going to change. And it's going to be over millions of years. The second is punctuated equilibrium. This is the idea that speciation occurs in rapid bursts with long periods of genetic equilibrium in between. It basically says that organisms and populations stay the same. They're under genetic equilibrium. The genes are coming in and out. Things kind of stay the same. And then we then have periods of rapid bursts of change that occur within 10,000 years or less. So, it's still taking a long time in terms of our thing, but it's saying that it can have bursts of time. So if you look at our trees down here, these are called cladograms. These straight edges represent little or gradual change over long periods of time, and then we have branching off. And those branches off could be rapid changes in phenotypes during speciation that could, these periods of time could last 10 years or so 10,000 years or so. So it's that branching off that occurs more quickly, and then we have a period of time when things are more stable and we have genetic equilibrium. That's punctuated equilibrium. That is the idea that's more mainstream nowadays. So what are the patterns of evolution? And remember, Darwin's finches was a great example of evolution. First, we have divergent evolution. This is when the species that were once similar diverge or become increasingly different. So at one point, they were very much alike, and then they became very different. Why? For some of those reasons that we may have talked about. Maybe they were, separated geographically, etc. The second type of pattern of evolution is adaptive radiation. And this is when ancestral species evolve into an array of species that fit their habitat that they're in. This is Darwin's finches is an example of that. These guys are ancestrally alike. They were isolated, geographically isolated on the Galapagos Islands. And on these different islands, they had different food sources. And to be able to get their food sources, they had different shapes beaks because they were easier. That shape of beak was easiest to get that food type on that particular island. Convergent evolution is when organisms that are distantly related have similar traits. We call those analogous structures. Remember back from earlier in our notes, analogous structures, because they evolve from similar environments. Please know this table and understand that these are not ancestral changes, that these are changes that evolve in similar environments. Note that a great example of this is your flying squirrel and your flying flancher in Australia. And notice that these are placenta mammals and marsupials, which means it's very different on how their young are born. So that are our notes for Chapter 15. Please study those through for the test.